My name is Lalobo Richard Kidaga. Welcome to this program. In this program or channel, we look at the facts, experience, observations, and try to come up with the truth. The topic for discussion today is why Africa is poor, or why Africa has remained behind. Africa lost its power and wealth and never regained it. In the 14th century, the Eastern African Indian Ocean trade was booming in the towns of Kilwa, Sofala, Malindi, Mombasa, and many others. They also traded with the interior, with the kingdoms like Zimbabwe in iron, ivory, and gold. The Western Africa was the home to the richest man, Mansa Musa. By then, Africa was well connected to the rest of the world, like Europe and Asia. They also had a good government. Between the 14th and the 15th century, Africa prosperity began to fall behind the rest, mainly for two reasons. One, the Ottoman Empire, and then two, the Western European Empire. The Ottoman Empire needed slaves, and they could easily get it in East Africa, and this continued up to the 19th century. The Western European Empire also needed slaves, and this could be got from West Africa. Later on, they needed slaves to work in the plantations in America because the mines were drying up. This, of course, had long-term effects on the African economy because the African craftsmen had been enslaved. The skilled men of Africa, the blacksmith and many others, had been captured and sold into slavery. So there was a vacuum. During the Industrial Revolution, it required numbers. It required a big population, first to work in the industry, and two, to provide the market. Africans had sold fellow Africans, and it had collapsed. Whereas during the Industrial Revolution, the Europeans and the Americans produced and outcompeted Africa, and therefore Africa became insignificant. In 1870, the ocean transport facilitated the European and the American trade, and that means they became richer. In 1871, the King of Belgium decided that Belgium should get colonies. Other Europeans or European countries followed suit. Hence, in November 15, 1884 to February 26, 1885, the Berlin Conference was convened, where the Europeans decided to partition Africa amongst themselves. This therefore meant that Africa had lost its sovereignty. The future of Africa would be decided in Europe and not in Africa. Europeans were deciding for Africans in Europe without Africans and away from Africa. It was a very, very big blow for the Africans. Africans were driven out of the fertile land, which now became white farms. And the Africans still were forced to work on these farms as laborers for the Europeans. So this is a situation where a landlord gets dispossessed and is turned into a porter or a laborer. So you can see how much an African was reduced from being a landowner to being a porter by a foreigner on his land. The infrastructure that were developed by the Europeans by then, or the colonials in particular, were to facilitate trade and to connect to the seaport for export. So you can see that their infrastructural development was selective, strictly to the areas which were producing the raw materials they needed for their industry and connecting it to the sea route for export to their countries. Then the other problem also was replacing African leaders with European leaders. This meant that Africans never learned any skill. What made the situation even worse even jobs which were semi-skilled, which Africans could do, the Europeans chose to bring in what? Indians. For example, during the construction of the Uganda Railway, instead of using Africans in the construction of the railway, the British opted to bring in the Indians at the expense of the Africans. As if that was not enough, they even made the Indians to conduct the business and the commerce in the town. They were the shop attendants and the ones selling in the shops. Africans were not what? Allowed to do business or sell in the shops. This is a sign that there was a deliberate move, a deliberate policy to keep the Africans low so that they would continue exploiting them. So the problem is the colonialists left the country without people and connectivity. The colonialists left the country without skilled people and connectivity. When you look at it critically, it was by design that they did this, because an African was never meant to go beyond a certain point, because they came to exploit him, and therefore they had to contain him. And one way of containing him was to make sure that he did not go very far with his education and he did not have many skills, so that they could contain him easily. Then another bad thing they did was to reward the office jobs of people working in offices more than the farmers. And yet the money for paying these people was mainly from the production, the agricultural background, because Uganda is an agricultural country. Therefore, most of the exports were of agricultural nature, like coffee, cotton, and many others. So creating an impression to the African that office work was more paying, yet the real source of the money was from the production in the agricultural sector, was very misleading, and it has had long-lasting effects. Like up to now, when graduates qualify, they are always seeking for jobs in offices, not creating their what? Unemployment. So this is a colonial mentality, a syndrome of colonial education, which has really caused a lot of trouble in Africa. Now the government is trying to change the curriculum. We appreciate that. But it has just begun, and we hope it will pick up. So we can see that even up to now, we are still grappling and battling with the effects of colonial education. So colonial negative policies, like limiting the level of African education, was another problem. Because as far as the colonists were concerned, Africans were not supposed to be educated up to a certain level, because they were designed to serve the white man and prepare them properly to be exploited. The missionaries, on the other hand, softened the Africans using Christianity, but also divided the Africans. For example, in 1888, in Buganda, there was a clash between the different religious denominations in Buganda. The British used indirect rule in Uganda and always sided with the stronger nations and used some of their agents, like Semeyi Kakungulu, to extend their power to the east. But it's so funny, because you would expect that after using Semeyi Kakungulu, he would be rewarded for the efforts that he had put in supporting the British and expanding the empire. But it was surprising that Semeyi Kakungulu was also not pleased with the British, and instead tried to fight them. But he could not, of course. The British were too powerful for him, and he ended up a miserable person. Between 1945 and 1975, Africans began clamoring for independence. I want to make this clear. It's only the United States which actually fought the British and got independence on the 2nd of July 1776. The rest of us, the Africans, were given, or the independence was negotiated through the United Nations. Perhaps that's why we cannot protect our democracy like the Americans do. The Americans shed blood to get their independence and democracy, and I think that's why they cherish it and they protect it. In Africa, where we were handed or negotiated for, we don't seem to be able to protect the democracy so dearly like the Americans. The post-independent era of Africa was characterized by the effect of the Cold War. The East led by Russia, and the West led by America and the Western European countries, where we get the KGB versus the CIA, SIS, the MI6, and the Mossad. On 9th November 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, President Putin of Russia now was a colonel in the KGB, and was at the KGB headquarters in Berlin, burning papers, trying to destroy them so that no one would lay hands on them. So when you look at what's happening now, it seems Putin is suffering from the nostalgia of the former USSR. And that's why he's attempting to redraw the boundaries. How far he will go, we are yet to see. So the fall of the Berlin Wall meant the fall of communism in Eastern and Central Europe. Shortly afterwards, it marked an end to the Cold War, which was declared in Malta. 3 weeks later, the German unification took place. The Cold War saw the fall of many governments in Africa. Many rebel groups were formed, some took over power, others did not succeed. Russia and America were always on opposite sides. If one supported the government, then the other would support the rebel group. We seem to be back to the era of coups. We saw this in Mali, Sudan, Equatorial Guinea, and many others. In an attempt to check these coups, the African Union put in place a think tank called the African Union Action against coup d'etats. We are yet to see how far it will go. The colonial masters gave Africa or African political independence, not economic independence. This is what we call neocolonialism. So it meant that Africans still had to rely on the white man for economic survival. That is why countries in Africa still get loans from the World Bank Group with the conditions attached. China has also come up and it is giving loans, but its conditions are not as tough as those of the Europeans or the World Bank Group. However, when it comes to paying, the country pays through the nose. Because with China, it will not hesitate to take over national assets to repay its loan, like it did in Zambia, where it took over the Ministry of Internal Affairs to repay its loans. Africa must learn how things work and make it work for her. On the 6th of August 1945, when an atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima during the Second World War, Russia worked tooth and nail to smuggle samples of uranium to Moscow. The Chinese likewise worked very hard to get to where they are. I don't want to go into the details of how the Chinese worked out their way to get where they are. That will be a topic for another day. So nobody will help Africa. Africa must work very hard to get out of poverty. It is a very rich country with all the resources, but something is lacking in Africa. Some sons of the soil know what to do to make this work, but they are not being listened to. But with the time, we shall see the light. But Africa must work very hard to get itself out of poverty. Nobody will do this.